This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
Welcome, and thank you all very, very much for coming out in the rain to hear the very distinguished panel we have tonight talk about both what has just happened and what things look like going forward, both nationally and here in California, where a few perhaps unexpected things occurred. You should all have a copy of our little program guide, and I will introduce the speakers momentarily. Before I do, I want to thank some people who have helped us out on this as co-sponsors. First, the Institute of Governmental Studies for being one of our co-sponsors. The University Library, my colleague Tom Leonard, who is somewhere here. Thank you, Tom. And the Journalism School, obviously. The Media Studies Program and our interim dean and former dean, Professor Tom Goldstein. And last but not least, the Berkeley Political Review on the far left. Not necessarily politically, Professor Bruce Kane, late of UC Berkeley Department of Political Science, now of Stanford University, or at least starting in the summer of 2013, where he will be signing on as the faculty director at the Bill Lane Center for the Study of the American West. I hope I have all of that correctly, and is currently working on a book about all the big stuff, like electoral colleges and how we vote and voter suppression, all the sort of underlying questions I hope we can get to tonight. Did I say that right, Bruce?
That works.
It works? Okay. And next to Bruce, Professor Lisa Garcia Bedoya, here did I finally get it right, of our Department of Education and the Poli-Sci Department here at Berkeley. She wears two hats, a specialist in studying both Latino politics and something we want to talk a lot about tonight, which is get out the vote methodology. One of the new strains of political science is studying, perhaps as the Obama campaign did, exactly what techniques work to persuade voters. So we'll have a chance to ask Lisa about that. The prize for coming the longest distance belongs to, the prize for coming the longest distance belongs to Ron Elving, but before I get to Ron, the prize for coming the hardest distance belongs to Professor David Kennedy of Stanford University, who bravely put up with 2 hours of impossible traffic in the rain. David is a professor, a very distinguished professor of history, and of course you probably know a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and I'm going to screw up the name of his book, so I will simply not say it. David, Fear and?
Freedom from Fear.
Freedom from Fear, studying the U.S. in the period between the Depression and the Second World War. Sitting next to, the current faculty director of the Bill Lane Center for the Study of the American West. Next to Professor Kennedy, Ron Elving, senior Washington editor at National Public Radio. You probably know his voice better than you know his name. The world's living expert on minutia of Congress and elections. And most important, an alum of the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, and next to Ron, Michelle Quinn, an alumna of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, and now of Politico Pro, which is the very expensive part of Politico that you have to pay for, and covering politics and technology from Silicon Valley. So thank you all for turning up on a very rainy night. Much as I'd like to start this conversation discussing Petraeus, you have no idea how I want to chase that ambulance. Perhaps some of you will. I feel that I probably should start this by asking you the question I put to my students a couple of days ago, which is, can each of you, in 1, 2, maybe, simple sentences, because we've heard every theory in the universe, tell us what happened in this election? This was a status quo election. This was a major new mandate election. This was the beginning of the end of the Republican Party. Pick your sentence, but it can only be one because this is journalism. Okay?
Right.
All right, Michelle, you start.
Well, Barack Obama won. I think that happened.
Not good enough.
And
why?
why?
We wanna
And
know.
most people voted for him, and so did the electoral college came through. And I think that maybe there was a status quo. I would go for the status quo. He got the vote out, and people didn't want that much change. He also got lucky that the economy got better. That's my personal opinion. That I was that if the unemployment rate had started climbing, he would be maybe not President Obama today. That's my
Okay,
sense.
that's more than one sentence.
Okay.
All
Sorry.
right. Ron Elving.
I think we'll look back on the 2012 election as the last time in a national election that the Republican Party tried to tough it out on the demographics of the 20th century. Those of you, and I'm sure most of you in this room in the category, remember 1984. Ronald Reagan got roughly 60% of the Anglo-white vote in the United States, won 49 states, and was crowned essentially the king of American politics forever. Mitt Romney got roughly 60% of the Anglo-white vote and is not president, and only got 203 electoral votes. That, to me, is the summary of this election.
All right. I am, for the moment, going to skip David because I want him to play cleanup on this question and go to Professor Garcia-Bedoya. What's the one-line takeaway?
It's about women of color. Most people don't realize that the majority of white women actually supported Romney. And because not only women of color turn out at a higher rate than men of color, for lots of reasons, which we can talk about, and the fact that the gap in their support for Obama was so overwhelming, they're the ones that put him over the top.
All right. Bruce Kane?
Well, I agree with everything else, but my contribution will be that the fear of outside money and voter suppression did not, in the end, make the difference that some people either feared or hoped for.
Okay. And Professor Kennedy, from the viewpoint of a historian, will this be regarded as any kind of watershed whatsoever, or is this just an ordinary election? And the last one was historic for different kinds of reasons.
Well, I have a question for you. Do historians and/or cleanup hitters get more than 2 sentences?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Especially people who had to drive.
Since everybody else did.
So you take off.
Well, my two sentences would be, demography is political destiny, echoing what Ron said. And my second sentence is quite simply, the digital age is now. And now I'm going to dilate a little bit. Interestingly, in the long drive up here from Palo Alto this afternoon, we heard a report on the radio that the Obama campaign outspent the Romney campaign by a factor of 10 on politicking through social media. And it was something like 45 million to 4 million, roughly, round numbers. And I think that goes both to the demographic and the digital implications of what I said a moment ago. So let me just sketch a kind of a very brief satellite level view of the intersection of media and political behavior in the last century. And I'm going to report to you an observed phenomenon, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it, so we'll leave that to people on the panel who know more about these things than I. But there seems to be a cycle of about a 10-year interval between the introduction and mass adaptation of cutting-edge technologies of mass communication and the moment when somebody figures out how to make really effective use of it. So just think it through for a minute. The radio comes on board essentially 1920, give or take a year. Calvin Coolidge used it, Warren G. Harding used it, Herbert Hoover used it, but the first person to really make significant political use of the radio as a political tool was Franklin Roosevelt, roughly a decade, 12-year interval there. Television begins to enter American households roughly 1950. Harry Truman used it, Dwight Eisenhower used it, but the first person to make really effective use of television as a medium, not least of all by telecasting press conferences and thus disintermediating the traditional press, was John F. Kennedy. The internet comes available in the 90s, the first person to really make effective use of it. Howard Dean a little bit maybe, but essentially it's Barack Obama in 2008. And then maybe the time scale is collapsing a bit as we approach the present. Social media began to be out there in the digital world a few years ago, and Obama apparently used it extremely effectively in this election to take advantage of that demographic difference between the electorate he was appealing to and the legacy electorate that Romney tried to mobilize. But as Ron has correctly pointed out, there aren't enough of them, or us, anymore. So that's my 2 sentences.
All right, no, that's a pretty
good.
good 2 sentences, and it tees it up nicely for Michelle, sitting in the heart of Silicon Valley, the quietest group of potential political lobbyists with lots of money, or seemingly so. Is that right? Would you agree with David? And B, where was Silicon Valley in this election?
Great questions. I'm not so sure. I mean, I guess I want to combine David and Lisa's answers a little bit and get out the vote. Because at least when it comes to social media, the Pew studies show us that actually the people who are making decisions and moving positions based on social media are young Democrats. So the more Democratic you are, the more liberal you are, the more you're on social media doing politics. So it made sense for Obama's team to be spending money in that realm for those individual personal emails saying, Michelle wants you, from Michelle or whatever, buying up names on Twitter. I think that made sense given who your demographic was. Republicans had really hoped that it was not going to be that way. I talked to a lot of Republicans on the Romney team who were spending a lot of time and money on social media. Obviously, they didn't spend enough. Or they made a decision, that's not our people, really, to get out the vote. And I just want to say something about your thing about Silicon Valley. It's so interesting to me because Silicon Valley did give a lot of money this time around. They were probably Obama's biggest supporter, and they also gave a lot of money to Romney. I mean, maybe Obama got maybe 3 times as much from Silicon Valley tech companies so Obama got 3 times as much as Romney. But Romney was in the money. He did better than McCain. So, and yet it didn't quite make sense because really Romney should have been the tech industry's guy. He said he wanted everything that they wanted, all the things they wanted. He was going to be easygoing on antitrust. He was going to be, let them bring back taxes. And so I don't know. I guess I'm thinking the tech industry is in this position of they made a decision that he was going to win, that Obama was going to win, so they gave the money, but holding their nose. I don't think they would necessarily support him 100%. So the question for them is, are they going to be listened to? Are they going to be treated like how they want to be treated, which is, we're the most, we're the darling of the economy, we're surviving, we're creating jobs. I think the tech industry wants to be treated with respect, but more than respect, wants to be kind of honored in some way and have their issues progress. And I don't know if that's going to be the result from this election, actually. Or will they be just looked as a niche?
Okay. Let me bring Lisa in on this one, and obviously if other people want to jump in as well. But Lisa, does this make sense to you that the confluence of the demography and the tech works to Obama's advantage, or are the groups that you were talking about impervious to whatever was going on in the technology and in fact much more responsive to other kinds of messages that had little to do with the technology?
I think it's the intersection of sort of old and new politics in this iteration. So I agree with Michelle that the people that Obama was targeting are the people who are using social media. And at least the MacArthur Youth and Participatory Politics Network just did a big study which found that youth of color are pretty equal to white youth in terms of their use of social media for civic purposes and for other kinds of purposes. So in fact, it is a space that's much more egalitarian than traditional voting, right, in terms of turnout. So using that space to encourage people to vote is probably very smart on Obama's side, and many of those folks, I think, were on their side. I think in thinking about the tech industry, the one issue I would say, though, that we have to consider is the tech industry's position toward immigration and the fact that they want immigration reform for high-tech immigration, and that's a big issue for many of those companies, and many of those companies are led by immigrants as well. So I don't think it's as clear that there weren't cross-cutting kind of interests, which may be why people were kind of ambivalent about the different candidates, but I think at least my husband happens to work in Silicon Valley, and all of their upper-level management are from either Asia or South Asia, and many of them have had visa problems. And so I think there's a sense that they can't do their business without some rationalization of the immigration system. And so I think that's something that also makes them appeal, the Democratic side appeal to them more than the Republican side, given the rhetoric. But the last thing in terms of that, and I think the rhetoric, part of what made social media work, I think, is not just what Obama was doing, but what was going on with other people in terms of getting out information about different kinds of campaigns, voter suppression. And so the places, ironically, Florida had pretty significant attempts at voter suppression this year. And I think part of why it didn't work is because the groups that were already organized on the ground for other purpose, kind of old politics groups, used social media and old politics to let people know what was going on and to get them. They actually had an increase in Latino voting in Florida this iteration. And I think it's because people got angry about the fact that they were trying to suppress the vote. So I think it's not. I think for young people, they're not mutually exclusive. They're kind of all a continuum of activity that people use in order to get messages out and to receive them.
Maybe I could get Bruce and Ron to talk a little bit about micro-targeting. For some of us, it would appear that the much vaunted Obama micro-targeting looks a lot like what was being done in this state way back in the 1940s, just with faster machines and computers and technology. To target better and to do things en masse the way people like Whitaker and Baxter could have only hoped to, or Richard Vigor even could have only hoped to in the 60s. Bruce and Ron, can I get you
Well,
to
I think
weigh
there's definitely a continuum in the way targeting is undertaken. I mean, if you go back to party machines, it was very localized. And people had ward bosses, and we still have some machines in this country, and they knew the residents, and they could turn out the vote fairly efficiently. But then of course the machines break up, and people are living in rural and suburban areas, and there's shall we say less of a kind of neighborhood cohesiveness. And you're right. The get out the vote 30 years ago was a sheet of Democrats or Republicans that was handed to a volunteer, and you would go door to door, and you'd be hit or miss. You'd be hitting people that were almost certain going to vote, or you're going to hit people that were on the other side. So there was always a danger that if you did a lot of voter contact, you'd be actually exciting the other side if you didn't do it accurately enough. And in fact, for a while in California, the consultants had a strategy of silent campaigns where they really went out of their way to make sure that they only got to their their own people, and they kept the rest of it quiet so that they didn't excite them. Now, of course, what's happening is the merger of marketing data with census data with other kinds of data sets, which we're seeing in academia, we're seeing in marketing, we're seeing in political consulting, allows you to create categories both in terms of the likelihood of voting and the fact that you may be on the fence, and then the ones that are committed Democrats and committed Republicans. But that's not new. It's just that it's refinement. And you're right, a lot of the turnout strategies and the social media strategies are sort of replicating what Clint Riley was trying to do. People may remember that Clint Riley was trying to do direct mail in a statewide race for Kathleen Brown. and got absolutely pilloried by everybody because we all assumed that he was doing this to make a buck, and of course it was Clint Riley, so he probably was doing it to make a buck. But he was also, in some sense, bringing, he may have been ahead of his time in a sense that it turned out not so much to be the mail, but now with social media or with the targeting, we're getting back to that sort of slice and dice of the electorate and trying to really target the message and the effort to get them to vote on the people that will have, be most affected by that. And that's, again, another long continuum that David's heard me talk about for the last week, so you'll be glad that I'm going back to D.C., which is the whole tendency of the professionalization of politics to conform to the efficiency norm. Not resources are scarce, and spending the money where it shouldn't be spent is something you try to avoid. And so in many different ways, whether it's the Electoral College or whether it's the swing seats or whether it's the technology and who it's target, increasingly you see a honing in on only the people that matter, who ironically are often the people not well informed or who are not the best citizens. So ironically, the people who get the most attention, the people who least deserve it, but that's the way the system works.
Ron, I was going to say, this can't be good for democracy. And is any of it good for electing congressional representatives?
Some of it is not probably good for democracy in the sense of the Robert Putnam bowling alone thesis, and we should not be disaggregating ourselves as a society and all living within our own array of screens, large and small and smaller. But there was a 20th century versus 21st century struggle in this campaign, and the Romney people were masters of the 20th century strategy. They raised more money than they possibly could have imagined ever raising, and certainly a record-setting amount for a non-incumbent president. And really, when you talk about raising $1 billion and you're not even an incumbent president, it had never been done before, anything like it. But that is how much they raised and spent. And you talk about efficiency, Bruce, because they waited to make their television buys until September and October. Great targeting. They knew exactly where they wanted to have it. But it turned out they needed to have it a lot of different places because they were losing in almost all the battleground states. And the problem with that in terms of efficiency is you discover that buying television time in September and October is like buying airline tickets. The longer you've waited, the more you're going to pay for it. Somebody's sitting next to you in a $149 seat for which you paid $1,000. And I don't mean those numbers idly. It's really that large a ratio. Right. They wound up wasting a great deal of their money. Meanwhile, over on the 21st century side, in terms of identifying folks, the people who devised the engines that drove the software that identified people and matched them up with people to go after them were people who had made their bones working for Google and working for another company called Facebook. And this is what they had not only done for a living, they invented it. They literally invented it. And they wanted to apply it to this new problem and refine it for their own reasons, of course, ultimately, the Clinton Riley's of their day. But ultimately, they also wanted to serve the purpose of reelecting the president. And let me just give you a personal example of how this comes down, because it isn't all cyberspace by any means. In the end, what it comes down to is mobilizing enormous numbers of people to do something very well targeted and efficient. For example, one of the editors at NPR is a man named Robert Garcia. He's about my age. He lives by himself in a nice apartment building in Northern Virginia, in Arlington, and they have a doorman. They're in a very strict policy for letting anybody in. No solicitors, no politics, nothing. You can't get in that building to do any of those things. That's one of the reasons he likes to live there, be left alone. One day he gets a doorbell, or rather a knock on his door, at his door in his apartment. He opens the door. It's a Sunday morning, about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. And there is a young Latina who looks at him and says, "I'd like to speak to Robert Garcia." And he says, "Well, I'm Mr. Garcia." And she says, "I'd like to find out whether or not there's anything that you need before Election Day, which is coming up next Tuesday. Do you need any information? Do you need a ride to the polls? Is there anything we can do for you?" Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And after they'd had a nice conversation, and he had said, I assume you're with one of the campaigns." She says, "Yes, I'm supporting the president." And then he said, "By the way, could I ask you one more question? How did you get in the building?" And she smiled and shrugged and said, "I live here." And the campaign had found just the person to talk to that person in that swing state who lived in his building and could get in and talk to him, and none of that was an accident.
Is there anybody beside me in this audience or on this panel who finds that whole thing just a little creepy? I mean, do you,
No.
David,
Well,
is there a
as Bruce just said,
backlash to this?
this is merely a modern means to replicate the old-style
Right.
ward politics, where the local healer or FA or wherever he was called,
Right.
Padron, knew everybody at that level and
Exactly.
went around before the election and said, you need a turkey for this weekend, or you need a ham, or you need
Right.
So the gift
basket of
bag from
groceries.
John Stewart with the weed
It
and
was
the color
really
contraceptives.
In its essence, this is an old story.
This is an old story.
But then I think you're right. Obama's camp got some blowback from people who felt it was a little too creepy. You know, they got like, well, you know, it almost felt like, we know that you went to visit this movie website, so now instead of going to movies, maybe you write the check. It was a little too targeted sometimes, and there was some pushback on that.
But I think the story is that this election, the nerds won. I mean, maybe the academics on the end. I mean, in the sense that they built these models. They didn't just use the public information, right? But organizations like Catalyst are building what they call progressivity models, which is basically identifying progressive voters by doing, basically, you know, figuring out what their characteristics are and then doing a backwards regression and attaching those characteristics to other people so that those are the people that you're targeting. And then you have Nate Silver. You know,
Many of us
all
worship
of
at
us
the
in
shrine
awe.
of Nate Silver.
But I think speaking to it is old school. It's what politicians have been doing for a long time, but at a whole other level of academic enhancement and precision. Yes, that's really impressive.
Just momentarily to your question of whether or not a congressperson could do this,
Yeah.
whether or not it could be used in congressional races, I think if it's done by the campaign for President Obama, it probably doesn't seem nearly as creepy as it would if it was your local congressman who was doing it. I mean, I don't know how many of you feel very strongly and positively about your congresspersons. Perhaps you all do. But my guess is that when people start getting this kind of contact from all other levels of politician, it's going to be a lot less welcome.
As long as you've mentioned Congress, let's just quickly sort of discuss the numbers and the surprises. And I mean, we used to call this coattails. Did Obama have some coattails in some places like North Dakota and Montana, and Indiana perhaps was an accident. Missouri was certainly an accident. But are there places where people who turned out for the president ended up voting Democratic who might not have otherwise voted Democratic? Is there any evidence of that?
Well, they say it's better to be lucky than good. It's certainly preferable to be both. A year ago, I don't know of anyone who didn't think the Republicans were going to take control of the Senate in this election, whatever happened in the presidential election, because there were 33 seats on the ballot. The Democrats were defending 23 of them. They had 6 or 7 retirements. A lot of them were in states that could be called red or near red. They had some troubled incumbents. They had a lot of real weakness in the lineup, and they wound up gaining 2 seats. I think people are going to be looking back on this one forever and asking, how did that team win? It just doesn't make any sense. It's really hard to find any kind of an analogy or a precedent for such an extraordinary performance, except to say that in a couple, 3 states with close races, I would say Montana and certainly North Dakota, possibly to some degree Wisconsin, although that's something of a separate story, the president's success was replicated almost to the percentage point by the Senate candidate. And had Romney been a much more successful candidate, or had, as Michelle said, the economy soured in the last several months, and noticeably even worse than it's been, it's entirely possible those states would have all gone Republican. And I think it's very likely that they would have. Certainly Indiana would have, had Richard Murdoch not been the nominee rather than Lugar. And I think Missouri surely would have gone Republican had they nominated any of the other candidates they had other than Aiken. But they insisted on Aiken, and he insisted on going out and burning himself down. And so you get a dynamic that is really inexplicable. It doesn't make any sense, except that is what happened. So then you just have to go back and say, well, that's why that particular set of results obtained. And it makes an enormous difference to Obama, not only to have won both the popular vote and the Electoral College, but also to have gained 2 seats in the Senate, even if they give one of them back and put John Kerry on Secretary of State or Defense. I think it makes a big difference to have more seats rather than fewer. The House was much weaker. Basically, their gains were in California and Illinois. and a couple of other places. It's not a great win for the Democrats in the House, but they did win the popular vote nationwide by about 1 million votes. Again, means nothing like the national popular vote does in the presidential race, but it's nice to have. And it's nice to be able to say more people voted Democratic for the House than voted Republican when people start telling you about their mandate, you know, to be the majority and so forth. So that's about the degree.
So let me make a couple points. First is that, we've got Henry in the audience, and we should ask him at some point. We'll get to Q&A, but there was some evidence in the exit poll of a higher level of party line voting this time around. Now, whether that translates out into the specific races we're talking about or not is the stuff that political scientists will be working on over the next 6 months or so. There's a lot of data that people can sort through, but there's a possibility that party line voting was up higher. Secondly, don't forget the turnout effect. We know the turnout effects matter, and if indeed, you know, the turnout was skewed up for Latinos, for African Americans, for more than the expectation, that would of course help as well. Now, of course, there's just related to this on Congress, we have to realize that we've gone back to the kind of congressional election we had, you know, prior to 2006. I mean, we basically had wave elections for the last 3 elections. The waves were going in different directions, but we had wave elections. This was not a wave election. This is back to what we were seeing in the early part of the 2000 decade, where it's just a small number of
incremental
seats. Yeah, incremental
way.
change. So it's kind of hard to read, you know. It's one thing to read the 2010 as a mandate. It's harder to see a swing of 7 seats or whatever it is in the end is big. Now, there is, by the way, a big, lively discussion going on in the political science blogs, which I'm sure only Henry and I read, maybe Lisa. But it's fascinating because people are spending a lot of time asking the following question. To what extent should the Democrats have gotten more congressional seats if the redistricting had not been controlled by, I think it's like 9 states?
Only political scientists
I understand
ask
that,
question.
I understand that, and we do it at weird hours when we could be watching TV or doing lots of interesting things. But you did mention that nerds won, so here we are. We're celebrating. Thank you very much. You know, the interesting thing is that, not that this surprises me because it replicates some stuff that I've done before, but it is now nationally true that when you look at it, there is something out of effect. That is the 9 states that were controlled by the Republicans. There are various kinds of methodologies. I will not bore you with the methodologies they use, but they sort of predict that the Democrats did a little bit less systematically in all 9 states than you might expect by various kinds of techniques, and the effects are still moderate to slight. What is becoming very clear, though, is that, and this is something I've been harping on in California, but now it's true nationally as well, is the inefficiency of the Democratic distribution. In other words, the Democrats are so heavily and densely compacted in urban areas that even the most fair-minded redistricting by the court or by redistricting commissions is going to end up creating seats that are won by the Democrats 75-25, 80-20, or sometimes, God, I think there were some precincts in Philadelphia I read that actually Romney got 0 votes, but okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. So I think, you know, the built-in are some disadvantages for the Democrats. It's not all that it was created by the redistricting. And I could go into it in detail, and I won't, but there are also some advantages because when you draw districts on the basis of people and not voters, one of the things that these people are finding is that in heavily Hispanic states, the biases are relatively minor, and that's because you have offsetting biases that, yes, they're concentrated, but there's a smaller number of voters in those areas.
Except Texas.
No, actually, Texas is true.
No, I'm saying just because their districting plan was so awful.
Oh, yes, it was awful, but there was the bias, you know, the bias was estimated to be small. Yeah.
Inside baseball.
One state.
Well, we are playing baseball.
Yeah, Ron wants in on inside baseball.
One state to illustrate Bruce's point, I think, pretty well is Pennsylvania, where the Democrats won the vote for the House statewide, 2.7 to 2.6 million. Nonetheless, despite the Democrats winning more votes for the House, The Republicans got 13 of the 18 seats. 13 out of 18, despite the fact that statewide, they lost.
Bruce, can I ask you to bring what you just said back home here to California?
Sure.
Because we now have citizen redistricting.
Right.
And that was supposed to bring everybody to the center, make the two parties more competitive, lead to more balanced legislative chambers and so on. Instead, we get super majorities of Democrats in both houses.
Right.
So can we connect those dots? Is there a connection between citizen redistricting and those big Democratic majorities?
Well, now, there's a loaded question. I mean, the honest answer is that the Republicans got caught by surprise because of the demographic change. You had an enormous amount of Latino growth that moved eastward. And so the normal expectation is that if the population moves eastward, that it therefore will be more Republican. But when you actually look at it, a lot of that growth was Latino, and it's protected under the Voting Rights Act. And so what you're now starting to see is a reversal of the conventional wisdom inside the Republican Party, where the wisdom was that the Voting Rights Act was a political tool for the Republicans because you could pack Democrats and get an advantage. And of course that makes sense when we were talking about the urban densities in these areas. If you, in addition to having dense concentrations, you can draw even denser ones because of the Voting Rights Act, then you can really pack it in. But it turns out that a lot of that movement out into the Republican areas they didn't anticipate, and then combined with the Voting Rights Act, you had an enormous amount of displacement out in the Inland Valley and the Riverside, East Los Angeles areas that pushed out a lot of Republicans. And so you see, ironically, none of the Democrats really ended up having serious races. I mean, McNerney, people were worried about, but he ended up winning fairly comfortably. Lois Capps, we hardly ever talked about Lois Capps. She has, by all the statistics, she should have had an absolutely tight race, and yet she won that very. Most of the tight races that we were looking at were the Lundgren race, the Bilbray race, the Bona Mac race, which wasn't even on our radar screen, to be honest, right from the start. So, I think if you look at it, what happens is you don't have strict proportionality when you have a district-based system. I know I'm going to get nerdy. You're going to cut me off. You're going to cut me off. But let me just say it, okay? Because it's an important point. You can't expect, as a party starts to get to 55, 56, 57% of the vote, the S-shaped curve starts to separate from the proportionality line. And that's the way the system's supposed to operate. It's supposed to exaggerate the seat total. If you want to go to a pure PR system, we can fix that. But that's what you would expect in an S-shaped
representation. Yeah, Lisa.
Well, I just want to add that the increased turnout in the Inland Empire wasn't just demographics. You've had concerted organizing by a number of different cooperatives and coalitions to actually get that vote mobilized, and so it worked. And
where it didn't work, there was a seat they should have gotten in the East San Gabriel Valley, and they didn't get it because the Latino mobilization. Under the top two rules, they took that first round for granted, and then they ended up losing the seat. Yeah.
With the bad candidate. I mean, this is probably as good a time as any to quickly talk about voter suppression and then move on to what does the next couple of years look like at the national level, and what does it look like in California under, we haven't even talked about Prop 30 yet. So can we talk about what happens now? How does California get governed with a supermajority? What does the Republican Party do to attract Latinos? Is that even possible? Lisa very wonderfully came to my class and said, if they can't do it in California, transform themselves to a moderate party, how on earth will they be able to do it nationally? So can we talk a little bit about that?
You want to start there?
Yeah, go ahead.
It relates to voter suppression in the sense that there's been a lot of discussion since the election about how comprehensive immigration reform is going to be the magic bullet, both for the Democrats and the Republicans, in terms of solidifying the Latino vote. And I think it's important to point out that while immigration policy is important to Latinos, it's never one of the top 3 issues, or very rarely in polls. What immigration has become is this, what I would call a gateway issue. It really is telling us what the candidates think about us, what the parties think about us. And so it's not just the policies that the Republicans have been following, it's also the language that they've used to describe those policies and the ways in which they racialize a particular population, even if you're native born. Things like SB 1070 are hurting. The Warren Institute here has done some really great studies showing that secure communities and SB 1070 has resulted in many native-born citizen Latinos getting pulled over, having to show their paper, having to prove their citizenship and all that kind of stuff. And so voter suppression has actually ended up being framed in very similar ways in the sense of who's the boogeyman that you're trying to keep from voting. It's usually an undocumented immigrant. And in the current environment, that undocumented immigrant is Latino. And so I think what happened in Florida, at least it looks like, is that those attempts to actually turned themselves around and got people to turn out to vote. And so I think that, at least in California, what we've seen is you've always had these Republican strategists, at least for the last 10 years, saying the demography is not in our favor, we need to change our strategy, and the party has moved further to the right on this issue. And so I don't see any good reason to imagine that somehow the National Republican Party is any more instrumental than California's. And I think the problem is they'd have to lock off a big portion of their base that is not willing to go quietly into the night and simply ignore the issue. So I think there's going to be a lot of work to do. And even if we pass comprehensive immigration reform, which I hope may be possible, God willing, the Republican Party is still going to have an issue. And I'm not sure that they can fix it.
Yeah, well, let me just say on the voter suppression, there were 4 main categories. There were the voter ID laws, there were the registration restrictions on groups like the League of Women Voters. I mean, and fining them if they got heavy fines. And Rock the Vote, nonpartisan groups that were doing outreach. There were restrictions on early voting.
Yep.
There was voter challenges. It turns out a large number of states actually allow for voter challenges. You can actually challenge the credentials of voters, and that can turn into voter caging, which is you challenging the people who you send mail out to when it comes back. And then there's citizenship requirements. And to be honest, I don't know that we've passed that just because it didn't work this time. Because, to be honest, I think there are genuine, maybe misplaced, but nonetheless genuine fears that these people have. I don't think it's all strategic. I think a lot of people have this fear. And there probably, by the way, is voter fraud, but it's not in-person voter fraud. It's probably happening with absentee ballots. That is, probably people are filling out the ballots who shouldn't be filling out the ballots, and yet we're not focusing on that. Remember one thing, and I'll finish, and that is that a lot of these laws were either stopped by, there were 14, I think, states in which the laws were either stopped by a governor or stopped by courts. Paused, that's right, and some of them will continue. And if you're interested in this, the best website with all this information is the Brennan Center website. They have a number of really good studies with good descriptive statistics, and they can really give you the overview of, in a timely way, of what's going on in terms of voter suppression.
But just to give a sense of the racialized nature of the laws, like in Florida, where the League of Women Voters was also the problem, on the Sunday before Election Day in 2008, a third of African American voters and 25% of Latino voters cast their ballots in church. They had Vote for Your Soul movement. Right. One of the days that the state of Florida removed from early voting in this iteration was that Sunday before Election Day, explicitly. And they ended up having to bring it back. But it's explicitly trying to keep certain people from the polls. And I think that...
and trying to keep the churches out of the involvement.
Right.
There is a measure that would be tremendously clarifying with respect to voter registration and voter suppression. And it would also contribute to clarification in the immigration debate or the policy, and that's a national ID card.
Yeah.
But culturally, we just don't like it. There's no structural or institutional impediment to it. It's just a psychological barrier. We don't want to carry that thing around. But it would actually bring a lot of clarity to a lot of these issues.
Yeah, and if it's paid for by the state, I mean, and you do outreach, the problem is that all of our attempts to try to fix things nationally are undercut by the fact that under the U.S. Constitution, the time, state, and the time, place, and manner are given to the states. And in a number of the states, we have partisan election officials. So you just unless you have a national control over that, you just don't know what people are going to do in South Carolina and Alabama with a law like that. Maybe you can only pick up the card on Sunday evening at 2 in the morning, you know, if you live in certain parts of the state. You know, who knows?
And beyond that, why would we assume that it couldn't be counterfeited? I grew up in Los Angeles. You go to MacArthur Park, you can become anyone you want for how much money. You can get any form of identification of any sort that you want if you have enough money. I mean, the presumption that you're going to have a national voter ID that is any more secure than your state ID or any of those things is, I
for
think,
now
unrealistic.
that's true. But Lisa, I got to say, we've got to do something to fix our election administration. We averted a disaster this time, but these issues are not going to go away. And you know, I don't know that a voter ID card is the #1 thing, but at some point we're going to be able to do, you know, retinal recognition or some sort of biological recognition. But you know,
That's creepy.
We just think that's by biometric technology is there.
all right,
But we
well,
think
all
it's
right,
creepy.
you know, you can't have your cake and eat it too, guys.
Popping
I mean-
eyeballs out like Tom Cruise and
my
on the
God.
black market.
Well, okay, but you know, a lot of other democracies have, including, as I recall, Mexico
Yes, they do.
manages to run these elections with a lot of trouble with these voter ID cards. Right?
Election day is also a holiday, and it's requirement.
Well,
of
I was
okay.
going to say,
They do a lot of things
Put it all in the
differently,
package
yeah.
then. Put it all in the package.
why can't we have all of you? I don't believe this is unconstitutional. Could you not have a national law that said voting will be on Sunday or on a national
federal
holiday on a
elections, maybe.
Monday for federal
Federal
elections?
elections.
Well, that's really the big part of what we're talking about. Wouldn't that solve a lot of the problem?
Sounds very 20th century to me, to use one of Ron's tropes.
Why?
Not least of all because so much balloting is now done by absentee,
Right.
and that seems to be the direction things are going.
Then let me
So
vote at my
designating a day and a
ATM.
place
Let me
seems to
vote
be
at my
less and less
ATM.
wrong.
Right? I trust my bank with my
Your
precious
fingerprint.
money. You
That's
know.
one place the nerds are not ready. Voting
Exactly.
online is probably not going to happen, probably for
Well,
decades.
And we have an expert in the audience.
Okay, well,
We do,
we
okay.
will get
I'd like to hear
expert comment in a moment. I want to ask David for the satellite view again. Could we say that we've seen the end to the Southern strategy? Republican Party, whatever they do for their second act, could we say that the Southern, and Ron, if you want to weigh in on this as well, but I mean, is that done?
Well, though it was denied for quite a while, I do believe there was such a thing as a Southern strategy, and I think it's still at least vestigially with us. It was heavily racialized in its original incarnation, but there's another element in this that, to my mind at least, is understudied, although maybe I'm just not up to date. But there's a phenomenon that historians and others, demographers, call the replacement South. That much of the growth of the Southern population, its growth in the Electoral College and House of Representatives and so on, is due to extraordinarily higher than national average growth, especially in the Southeast, South Atlantic states. That region and the American West have been the two fastest growing regions for a long time. And a lot of that growth in the South is actually the result of northern migration into the South.
Right.
That's less easily characterizable as attaching itself to ancient Southern racial prejudices. So there's more at work in this than just the racial explanation of a Southern strategy. But nonetheless, taking all that into account, it's true that in presidential elections, at least, the South has been a consistently safe place for the Republican Party since the 1960s. So there it is. So did we see any cracks in that this time?
That's what I'm asking you.
The big one that may come into play, not least of all because of the Latino vote, is Texas.
And how about Georgia?
If Texas, well,
It'll be a while.
Texas,
Georgia will be even
Texas
longer
is,
than Texas.
is so weighty in the system, it's the second biggest state, that if it becomes reliable for the Democrats, I think the Republicans have to reinvent themselves from the ground up.
Ron and Mich, I don't know if you want to weigh in on
I was
that,
just
but I've
going
got
to say Arizona in 2016 is a possibility in some people's minds. Texas 2020, and that Reince Priebus, the RNC chairman, the Republican National Committee chairman, said to us at NPR when he was there and on the record, he saw Texas as competitive for the Democrats in the presidential election of 2020, surely 2024, and by the time you get to 2024, I think you do throw in Georgia. So yes, they need to nominate I'm just throwing this name out, although I'm not the only one. They need to have a Marco Rubio or someone else who fulfills the imagination.
He will not fulfill, trust me. There are
I-
a few things that he fulfills in terms of not offending people.
I understand, and the David Rivera connection is the first one that comes to mind, and Mr. Rivera was defeated, and that's going to come back and blow back. And all right, there are a lot of problems with Marco Rubio, but right now in Washington, he is the flavor of the month. And a survey of Republican consultants and pundits and all the people on the right done after this election as to whom they should nominate in 2016, 27% went for Jeb Bush. Okay, predictable, fine, we get that. He was not the #1 candidate. 40% went for Marco Rubio. First term
Susana
senator. He was third.
Martinez. I don't understand why no one mentions. Anyway.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to the 2016 bench in a second. I want to ask Michelle and Ron in particular about what one of our members of the audience calls the Republican entertainment political complex, i.e. Fox News and right-wing radio. Does that change, right? Does that piece of
You mean, are you?
a strategy. Does Fox News become less a
Fair
going
and balanced?
proposition? Does Rush Limbaugh get sort of quietly trucked somewhere because because that just doesn't work anymore?
Oh, Rush Limbaugh is coming to NPR. Did I not tell you that?
You heard it here first.
And last.
That'll be the
Last,
proverbial snowy day in hell.
Well, I mean, I don't know about the Republican strategy, but it's hard to imagine those audiences. I guess the question is the elite of the Republican Party may wish that to happen, but that there's still this ground of audience that really resonates with those publications. And that's one thing I just want to come back to Marco Rubio and the Republicans. When it comes to immigration reform, the tech industry, at least my understanding has been, they don't really care about comprehensive, but they really want the workers they want. And the Republican Party has consistently come up with ways of separating that from comprehensive. So Rubio has a bill that was passed, and people want to separate that from comprehensive immigration reform. I wonder if that's going to change. I was just thinking when people were talking where the Republicans were like, let's just not get into comprehensive reform. Let's really just give it targeted what the tech industry wants. Now, given the election results, I wonder if that tune will change. Like, let's try to, Republicans will come out more with, let's solve this, which may disappoint the tech industry with one of its strategic bill.
We haven't talked really at all about California, and I want to give a few minutes to Prop 30 and just the California ethos, and then I want to talk a little bit about foreign policy, and particularly foreign policy as it relates to the West. So let's start first with a quick rundown on California and who's got a good Prop 30 rap. Are we once again leading the nation in deciding that perhaps we need to raise revenue, or are we just catching up to what some other states have already been through in a much more draconian sort of way? And does anybody think a 2/3 majority in the Assembly, particularly, means that the Democrats are going to do something in this state quite radical, like, repeal a couple of
I'm going
rotten
to defer to
pieces
Bruce
of
and others
legislation?
on this, but I will say, just to put it out there, that I heard a very good public finance economist at Stanford say just yesterday that there will never, the Prop 30 will never yield $6 billion in revenue. That those estimates are grossly too high.
Well, and whatever it yields, I mean, it's a patch, really, because it basically takes two taxes that we already have and it extends it for a temporary period of time in order to patch a structural problem that has to be addressed. And there are two problems with the patch as a long-term solution. One is that they're pro-cyclical taxes, and which has really caused enormous problems for us ever since Prop 13, because it means we have much more variable revenue, and we're trying to maintain levels of services, and under state law you can't run deficits, and so it's very hard to run the government and run the state, the local governments when the revenue stream gets increasingly volatile. We've known about this for 15 or 20 years. The second problem that it doesn't address is the narrowing of the tax base. The loss through internet sales, the loss through the fact that the economy has shifted and continues to shift in the direction of services, and we don't tax services. The one attempt we had to sort of think about this, which was the Schwarzenegger's tax commission that looked at a value-added tax. It just looked too scary to people. They didn't understand it. But there has to be some sort of comprehensive discussion about tax reform in this state, because right now what we want out of services, we don't have the revenue base for it. And this worked because he held hostage the two most popular parts of the state budget, which is K through 12 and higher education. And public safety, okay. But, we know from polling that those are popular elements. So when you threaten that, that's the Washington Monument strategy, you can only do that so often, right? Mm-hmm. And after a while, people are going to turn that down. So Henry and I were talking about that on the way over. I think they've got a little bit of a respite. They've got this 2/3 majority. They probably will have a hard time holding that because they don't have much of a margin of error. And remember the Gang of Five, and remember what happened in the 80s when the Democrats won Republican areas. They had Willie Brown had to deal with 5 people that were constantly voting against him and trying to unseat him. And the Democratic Party, it doesn't have the kind of discipline that the Republican Party has in this state, or indeed anywhere in the world. But anyway, and so it's going to be very hard to really push them into a Prop 13 kind of reform, or something that looks like a third rail and is potentially going to get these people voted out of office 2 years after they get there. So I think what they learn out of that is, yes, you're going to have to put structural measures and changes in front of the voters. That's where the Republicans made a mistake. It was one thing to say no to the taxes. It was another thing to say, no, voters can't decide. We're going to decide for them. And I think that if they use it constructively, they will try to find some answers to these larger structural issues and put it before the voters and hope that they can make the case.
But don't throw away my Democrats in disarray folder just yet.
Probably not.
Okay.
In fact, I would get it out.
Michelle, I have a question here from the audience about how important is either the Silicon Valley vote or the Silicon Valley funding. Of all of the groups that contribute money and loudly get their day in the sun, it feels like, as an outsider, Silicon Valley never actually gets heard. Are they getting something quietly done that we don't know about? Or is their money being spent unwisely, or do they basically not give a damn because they operate in some other realm entirely? And maybe David could have a whack at that too.
I think they gave a lot, and in 2008 they were a big part of Obama 2008. At least Google and Facebook was. But I guess I wonder if there's like an elite, the people who run companies versus the worker divide going on. But I think the tech industry gave a lot this year, and also gave a lot, like I said before, to Obama. But their issues are so niche, and they also go against some of the issues of the base. Like, for example, the billions of dollars overseas of overseas profits. The desire of the tech industry, the number one issue really is, will Obama let us bring this back at no tax rate, give us a holiday, or give us much discounted? And he went further in a State of the Union and said, not only am I not going to do that, I'm going to tax what you have over in those overseas banks. And so I was so shocked but that was a way of sort of telling his base in a way, which is, I'm not caving to the Wall Street moneyed point of view. So I don't really know. At the same time, if you look at something like Google's never been under such scrutiny as it is right now, and that's with an Obama administration that it helped bring in. So I don't know the answer. Like, what is the disconnect? I think for people, they just feel like the tech industry or the tech leaders think that the team that's in is probably the team they've got. So let's work with them.
Is there somebody in that tech firmament we should expect to see heading up the Commerce Department, or some other Washington-based
I don't
something?
know. Sheryl Sandberg her Facebook has been mentioned as Department of Commerce, and she might do it. I think she might be a great candidate for it, given her background. But yeah, I don't see a lot of people going over. I mean, in a way, the president created the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, which was sort of a disaster because a lot of those people gave money to Romney. And so they stopped meeting in January because it was, kind of meeting with your enemies in some way. So I don't know if it's, what the tech industry did get from Obama, and it was a big deal, was Obama administration came out against a copyright bill. That was a huge deal. That happened in January, right before it kind of hit the House.
It's all the stuff that doesn't quite make the general public radar, and in fact, they're getting what they want.
They got what they wanted. They came out with just a perfect blog post, and so I think that when the chips were down, the Obama administration was there for Google, Facebook, all those guys.
So, David, going forward, how influential, either quietly in the president's ear or by stamping their feet?
Well,
the folks of Silicon Valley.
I answered that a little bit impressionistically, but I live down there in the belly of the beast in Silicon Valley, and that's kind of the air I breathe, so I do form some impressions. And I agree with Michelle. I think big issues for the leadership in Silicon Valley have to do with intellectual property, antitrust. But two other big ones that are very consistent, I think, are free trade issues and access to world markets, and H-1B visas. And on both of those big policy issues, the Democrats have been more solid for Silicon Valley than the Republicans have. The visa H-1B immigration issue, that one's pretty clear. We've already discussed it. But the other big one, I think, is the way we face Asia in the next generation or so. And, of course, the big 800-pound gorilla in that room is China. And I think,
which has gone conservative, the New York Times tells me.
Well, I think when Romney assumed that confrontational attitude toward China both in the primary and the general election campaign, I think he scared the bejesus out of a lot of people in Silicon Valley, a lot of people generally who are in the export business. And lest we forget, or maybe you didn't know, but the 17 western states, the western area of the United States, accounts for 52% of all American exports to Asia. It is deeply in the interest of our region not to mess that up by picking a fight with China. And my own view is that the Obama administration thus far has been very astute in the way they've recognized the nature of this problem and very deft in the way they're taking steps to try to accommodate China into a world trading system that is more stabilized, where China recognizes the norms of intellectual behavior, joins the WTO, and so on and so forth. And to assume, as the Bush administration played with, and Romney apparently was promising to do, a confrontational attitude toward China, I think is bad politics and really bad business. So I think the Democrats have got a big advantage with respect to Silicon Valley on that very, very important strategic issue.
I've got a completely different subject for Ron Elving. It's from one of our audience members. How useful are the presidential debates? Should they be continued? Should they be formatted differently? I mean, this is a question that political science debates forever, and journalism usually debates it in the opposite direction. So what's the view here?
Too many journalists make fun of the debates, I think, and put them down and act as though they're not substantive enough. I think the debates, in some respects, if I were the Republican Party, I would be asking myself, did we have too many debates in the primaries last year because of what they did to the whole shape of their contest, and then what they did to the shape in which their nominee entered the fall. And I also think that the debates we had this fall between the two major party candidates were as significant probably as they have been in quite a while in determining the contest, if not the outcome. I think in the end the outcome was probably a little bit more preordained than most of us as journalists would ever like to admit. We love a contest. We love to say endlessly, 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 it's too close to call. And then, of course, we proceed to try every way we possibly can to call it. But this is just one of the built-in elements of the way we do media, of course, too, because we're trying to get eyeballs and we're trying to get attention from people. And so we do all those things. But with respect to this year's debates, I don't think there's any question but that in September, Barack Obama was walking, not running, but walking away with the election. There was no question. He was ahead everywhere. There was no doubt, and it was not too close to call. As of October 3rd, we did one of our NPR polls. The debate between, we have a Republican pollster and a Democratic pollster worked this out together. They had a little bit of a debate over the model and how many Democrats to have in it, et cetera, et cetera. But basically it was embarrassing because the president was so far ahead that it looked like promotion. So we had to do everything we could to kind of restrain the coverage of it. And Romney's still in striking distance, that sort of thing. That night, after that poll ran, we had the first debate. The president had the same problem that every president has had who has debated his opponent, and to some degree Richard Nixon as vice president in 1960 had. You get out on the stage with somebody who has never been close to the White House as an occupant, and suddenly you are brought from being the leader of the free world to being just another political candidate alongside another guy who is really eager to let you have it. It did not seem the president was ready to deal with that. It seemed that Romney was extremely ready to deal with that. I just came from a conference where Brett O'Donnell was one of the presenters, an extraordinary guy who prepared Romney for the debate in Florida in the primaries, where he turned around his losing aspect with Newt Gingrich and did such a good job and got so much credit for it that Romney promptly fired him because he got so much credit. He is widely considered the best college debate coach in the country. He took Liberty University, that obscure religious school in Virginia, to the national title. He's an extraordinary guy, very Republican, advised Michelle Bachmann, for example, and yet very interesting on the question of the significance of debates and how they have become, to some degree, the most substantive exchange we get between the candidates on something of an equal basis. They are the alternative to endless television ads, and I suppose you've all seen the number, but in this year, in this federal election, we exceeded 1 million television and radio broadcast ads. And you live in California, so you were spared most of it.
We didn't see any of them.
Yeah, I was going to say. Well, that
That's
leads
right.
me to the next set of questions, again from the audience. One about reform of the Electoral College, and one about the Australian ballot. So, Bruce, this is sort of your wheelhouse, but David, you may have thoughts about these as well.
What's the reform of the Australian ballot?
Not the reform of the Australian ballot, but going to the Australian ballot.
Mandatory voting.
You mean mandatory voting?
Yeah, well, they get I think roughly 90% electoral participation
Yeah,
rate.
Brazil, too.
But if I understand it correctly, the penalty for not voting is $10. So it's not
It may also be instant runoff voting they're talking about, the alternative vote in Australia.
Oh,
A system not entirely popular in the city of Oakland, but it depends, which candidate you are. But Bruce, I mean, is there any,
well, let's start with the
academics-
Electoral College. I mean, if the Republicans had lost the Electoral College and won the popular vote, then we would be having a serious discussion about getting rid of the Electoral College because the shoe would have been on the other foot. But the shoe didn't turn out on the other foot, and I've seen several Republican commentaries that suggest that they still believe that the Electoral College favors the Republican side, and small states, for reasons of just not wanting to lose leverage and be ignored, are going to resist it no matter what. And given, I mean, this gets to a deeper problem. Sandy Levinson, who is a constitutional law scholar at University of Texas, has two, I would call them almost scathing books, or at least scathing looks at our constitutional system. And it's not simply the Electoral College. There are all kinds of bizarre features of our system that need an overhaul, need another look. And
White guys in wigs.
Well, yeah,
we call that.
Well, okay, yeah, or lifetime appointment of Supreme Court, how long it takes before we inaugurate. I mean, you could go on and on. There's a whole bunch of things that if you sat down and you were starting from scratch, you wouldn't do it that way. But the problem that you have is that we made it very hard to change the Constitution by requiring supermajority votes at the congressional level and at the state level, and just in general, the politics of constitutional reform at both the national and the state level have become more complex because groups that get advantages out of the system are more adept at mobilizing against it. So state constitutional reform has basically died off since the mid-60s. So the bottom line is that because we can't do constitutional reform, we rely on the courts, or we rely on sort of extra constitutional means to sort of make the adjustment. And it's allowed us to limp by, but we are just flirting with disaster. Whether we're talking about allowing the states to control the electoral system or the electoral college or any of these things, or what, or whether we have any kind of provision for if the election, if the storm had wiped out 3 states, would we be able to postpone the election? We haven't got any plan for that. Lots of people are discussing whatever happens if there's a terrorist attack and they take out all the Congress and they take out the executive branch. What do we do at that point? All these things that you might think about in the modern world, we can't really address because of the stickiness of the constitutional system, and it's very frustrating to people that want to make reform.
So basically the answer is we wait until the disaster and then we adapt around it.
Add a word about the electoral colleges is in the boring category of historical perspective. But the fact is, in 220 whatever years of the existence of the Republic, there's only been this incongruity between the electoral college vote and the popular vote 3 times.
Right.
So, yeah, you wouldn't invent it today from scratch, that's for sure. It is a vestige of another era and its values and fears and hopes and so on, and I'm not trying to justify it, but it's hardly catastrophically broken. I agree with Bruce. If we had 2, or let's say, God forbid, 3 elections in close proximity to each other, where you had that disparity, then I think the public at large would get very agitated. But when we do this at century-long intervals, when it breaks down, it's not so bad.
I want you guys to take a look at the Republican bench in 2016.
Oh, God.
The House in 2014. And I guess I want to know first from David whether presidents in their second term govern differently, run out of steam. I mean, looking at the historical perspective, should we expect Obama to be braver, smarter, or will he just run out of gas, as one could argue several of them did?
Well,
has history already cooked whatever it's going to say about it?
Sometimes if you actually look at the historical record of second presidential terms, I'm reminded of the famous remark of George Bernard Shaw about second marriages, that they represent the triumph of hope over experience. Because the documentable record of second terms is really not very inspiring. I believe, off the top of my head, I think there are 12 presidents, elected presidents, who ran for re-election in the 20th century since William McKinley. 8 were re-elected, again testifying to the power of incumbency. 4 were not elected. The 4 who did not succeed were Taft and Hoover and Jimmy Carter and Bush 41. But of the other 8, the remaining 8 who had second terms, if you just go through the record, it's not a pretty record. I mean, Woodrow Wilson takes us into war that he promised the campaign not to, and then he fails to get the Treaty of Versailles ratified, and then he has a stroke and he's out of commission. Franklin Roosevelt opens his second term.
It's hardly his fault he had a stroke.
Franklin Roosevelt's second term almost immediately came to smash with the Supreme Court packing controversy. Eisenhower, not so bad a record, but not very controversial or in either term. Richard Nixon resigns in his second term amidst the Watergate scandal. Ronald Reagan hits the Iran-Contra scandal. Bill Clinton is impeached.
Wait a minute, I thought he ended the Cold War, Ronald Reagan. He just has better scriptwriters than
the momentum was there before the second term, I believe. But that's a matter of controversy. We could argue that one. But just in general, at a quick glance at the historical record, second terms, it's pretty hard to make the case that they trump first terms in terms of achievement. And in fact, they seem to be the portals to a lot of embarrassment and disaster for a lot of individuals that have got there. So on that historical record, there's not a lot of ground to believe that Obama's second term is going to somehow be shiningly better than the first term. And I have to believe that his first term actually has some very creditable accomplishments. I say again what I said a moment ago. I think he's been very deft in his management of foreign policy on a lot of different fronts, and I would include military policy in that general rubric. And I do think that the Affordable Care Act and the Dodd-Frank Act are now likely to stand as pretty substantial legislative achievements and affect the shape of life in this society for quite a long time to come. I hope he addresses things like immigration reform and a comprehensive energy strategy, and we get the deficit issue solved. He'll probably have partial success on all of those big ticket items. But I don't think there's any grounds to really expect that the second term is going to be brilliantly better than the first. The political landscape, as we said at the outset of this discussion, the political landscape, it's slightly more favorable, a little bigger margin in the Senate, not quite such a deficit in the House, but it is not a wave election.
And we've not mentioned those two horrible words, fiscal cliff. Do anybody want to just very quickly suggest whether there will be some kind of an interim solution? Are we headed for, Armageddon? I don't know. Ron and I, between us, have covered more fiscal cliffs than I think either of us would care to talk about. But I mean, does anybody have a sense of how that shakes out? And does disaster loom? Ron, you want to?
I guess this is a Washington responsibility. I will advance this thought that the talks they had today looked like the beginning of an actual negotiation. The market actually even turned up a little bit later in the day based essentially on what they heard from the Republicans coming out of that meeting. That may be illusory, but there is every reason for them for the Republicans, for example, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, to look to their governors. They have 30 governors, huge number, very, very strong group of people. They are very much pro-deal. They want a deal. They want something like what they do in their own states. They don't care if something has to be done on revenues, just move on. They can look to Wall Street. Wall Street's opinion is very obvious, could not be more so. And they are making that more clear all the time. Corporate America, corporate chieftains come to Washington now regularly in groups to bend the ears of the people that they care about. But at the same time, even given all of that and given the fact that I believe that the staffs in the Senate and the House have long since done the mechanics of a very comprehensive deal that would take care of all of these packages. We have the expiring tax cuts as of the end of this year. We have the sequestration that comes about because of the last deal they did in August of 2011, a true horror, to avoid defaulting on U.S. debt obligations. And that, by the way, is coming up again in January or February, part of the reason we have to do this now. Even down to alternative minimum tax and paying the doctors and Medicare. All of that. It's all done. It's done. They've got the cuts in Medicare, we'll call them something else, of course, growth restraint and cost. And it's really done if the political will is there to do it on the part of the leaders. I believe that the four leaders are willing to do this. It's kind of a cliche in Washington that it was a terrible thing for Nancy Pelosi to stay as leader in the House because she's so divisive and the Republicans don't like her and she can't cut a deal. My guess is that Obama needs her to keep the Democrats on board for the deal that he is now doing with Boehner, and that as long as she stays with the president, which I believe she will, she can bring the House. The House is now majority women and minorities for the Democrats. Most of the people representing the United States of America in the United States House, if they're Democrats, are either women or minorities or both. That's a big change, and Nancy bespeaks that change, and she can bring those people with her. So in all of those senses, it's there if she can bring her people and if Boehner and Mitch McConnell can bring their people. Now, having just watched this election, you've seen the primaries, you see what's going on in the Republican Party, it is very scary for the average Republican to be asked to do something like break the no tax increase pledge, the Grover Norquist curse. This is a very scary thing to ask people to do. It will take a lot of courage on the part of some fairly recently elected Republicans to get this done. And that, I think, is probably the question mark at this point, although there's a question mark on both sides. And that's the fiscal cliff.
Well done. All right, predictions down the line for 2016. The narrow bench on each side, Republican and Democratic, and then the final nominees in 2016.
Oh, come on.
Yeah,
She's so tough.
I tell you.
yeah, go ahead, Brucey.
Oh, sheesh. Well, all right, so I think it's Hillary on the Democratic side. I think she's stepping down and taking a well-deserved rest for a few months and
And then moving to
and
Iowa.
then moving to Iowa, exactly.
Okay, and Susan Rice goes to state, or
Yeah,
Kerry goes to
I
state?
think that the press conference was pretty revealing that Obama
Is pissed.
really feels this is outrageous. And as far as we can tell on the facts, it is outrageous. There isn't, she was simply reporting what she had been told to say. I mean, the only thing they have is that one of the guests that came before had suggested differently from Iraq. But, you know, I just don't think there's much of a case there. And I think you kind of wonder whether McCain and Graham were standing up maybe for the candidacy of Kerry, who was their old buddy. You know, whether it's the
So they were
Gang
on
of Brothers
purpose,
getting
they
back
were
there. Yeah, you
sideways
kind of,
twisting
That's
this
what
so
I'm
that-
wondering about this, because I just don't get it otherwise. It makes no sense.
Okay, so Hillary and who for the Republicans? Or the short list, at least?
Yeah, well, you know, that's a lot harder to say. You know, and I certainly don't want to say Senator Rubio and get Lisa all upset.
You can say whatever you want.
But yeah, I know. But to be honest, obviously Paul Ryan is in the mix. And
Really?
I think so. Yeah, I think he's in the mix. I'm sorry.
That's a side bet, Kane. That's a
Well,
side
okay,
bet.
let's take Christie. I mean, somebody like Christie.
He's
that-
12.
No. Oh, well,
I mean,
say what you
okay,
want,
but I'm
sorry.
saying that, you know, okay, you're back to, I mean, this is really a ridiculous discussion, but anyway.
This is a press discussion.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I mean, you know, there are solid people like Portman, right? But the problem has always been that the solid people don't get anywhere in this primary process. And then there are the, you know, the people that can flame out just by saying something outrageous or ridiculous, and that would be Christie, who obviously has gotten a big bounce out of this, and maybe the most sensible, even if outrageous, in sometimes, you know, of those people. But it's not clear that a guy that looks like Taft can get elected in the
Can't.
modern era.
No, he can't.
Taft couldn't get reelected.
Anybody in media will tell you he can't.
Okay, well, so I've said as much as I planned to say on the record. Thank you.
Lisa?
I agree about Hillary if she decides to run. I think it's going to be pretty difficult to beat her. On the Republican side, I think it depends on, I think what this election showed was the ideological fissure within the party. And so how that fissure gets resolved within the party is going to determine who the candidate is. If the more moderate side wins, sort of the more focusing on being fiscally conservative and getting further away from the social conservative issues, I think Jeb Bush, Mitch Daniels, like those would be guys on that side. I would bet a lot of money that there is no way possible that a Latino would either be number one or number two on the Republican ticket. I find it very unlikely, despite all the love that Rubio might be feeling at the moment. I think the person they should be loving is Susana Martinez, because she's just a much better candidate than he
So
is.
she's-
And she's
she's-
Mexican.
So she's who we should
Rubio's
be
Cuban.
keeping an
I
eye
say
on
this is Cuban.
regardless.
That's an issue. Huh?
Right? She's
Yeah.
who we should be keeping an eye on anyway, as a comic.
Yes.
She was a possible VP.
I mean, she's able to appeal to a broad group of people. She's seen as much more moderate. People like her. I mean, she's just a less polarizing person than Rubio. And thinking about if you're going to select Rubio because of Florida, Cubans are only a third of the electorate in Florida right now. Puerto Ricans are 27%. That's going to flip probably in the next election. So it's not clear that even winning the Cuban vote will win you the Latino vote in Florida at this point. So I'm not sure if Rubio helps, even as a number two,
Right.
that much.
David, are there any Californians in this mix?
Not that I can think of at the moment. And I guess on the Democratic side, I guess I agree with the default conventional wisdom that Hillary's the name that comes first to everybody's lips. But let's not forget she tried and failed 4 years ago. I don't think she's invincible. I think there are a couple of Democratic governors that are probably thinking about this matter. Cuomo, and somebody we haven't heard much about yet, but I think we'll hear more, is John Hickenlooper in Colorado. I think the two Castro brothers from Texas are likely to ascend to that level of consideration, maybe for the number two place on the Democratic ticket. Maybe 2016 is a little bit early for them, but they're certainly going to be in play at that national level. So that's just some random thoughts. On the Republican side, I'll leave that to my Republican friends, if there are any here, to speculate about that.
We'll make Elwood.
But I will say that
Speculate.
here's a prediction. And actually, it's something I predict with a little bit of hope that it actually happens. That the last Republican president, George W. Bush, seeks to rehabilitate himself in the public eye, and God knows he could use the rehabilitation, by taking a very forward position on immigration and teaches his party how important it is to take that position. He believes in that deeply and sincerely. He had a good record in Texas as governor. He did pretty well in 2004 with the Hispanic vote. I'm told by people who were close to him when he was president that the one day they saw him truly crestfallen was the day he lost the vote for his immigration bill in the House. So I think it's something he deeply believes in. I think he could do a real public service and a service to his party if he leaned forward and took a public stance on that issue.
And mainstream media would love that narrative. I agree with you on that. Elving?
Yes, I think the Republicans beat a path to Jeb Bush's door, whether he has to even go out and be terribly ambitious about it or not. I mean, if he could get his brother to perform a service like that.
And if George did that, he could detoxify the Bush name to a certain extent.
I think that's true. I think that's true.
All
Certainly,
in the family.
at least among some independents, and certainly among many Hispanics. And he got 40% of the Hispanic vote, which is looking pretty good right now. And that would, to a large degree, make it possible for a Republican to win with that big white vote if they could hang on to even 40% of the Hispanic vote. So they have to do one of three things. They have to nominate a Hispanic, and they may have a problem with individuals because, although apart from Susana Martinez, who I think is probably the best one, they're probably going to be more attracted to one of the guys, and it's going to be problematic. Then the other thing they could do would be to actually go ahead and pass the DREAM Act, which they could do in very short order, and then move on from there to comprehensive immigration reform, as you say. If they did those things, then maybe they could get away without putting somebody on the ticket, literally, in 2016. My guess is they'll go for the cheaper solution of just putting somebody on the ticket or acting as though they're going to. But I think Jeb Bush gets you where you can get without actually putting a Latino on the ticket, so that's why they'll do that. On the Democratic side, I think Hillary may hold off just a little while. This is not a popular view. I think she will wait for a little while and play Hamlet for a little while because she doesn't like the characterization of herself as being endlessly, ferociously ambitious. She would like to be wooed. And of course, the party will line up and woo her like mad because they don't want a primary. They really don't want a primary. Part of the reason they won this year, a big part of the reason they won was because Obama did not have a primary. It's the best thing an elected president can have is no primary when he runs for re-election. And that would really pretty much settle it. I don't see Andrew Cuomo taking her on. I don't see Martin O'Malley, governor of Maryland, or Mark Warner, or any of the other super ambitious people from the Middle Atlantic coming after her. If she wants it, if she goes after it, I think the party will coalesce behind her very early, and the money will be there. And in the end, it's ultimately about who can raise the money.
So you're predicting Bush Clinton?
I'm predicting.
Oh my God.
That's really disturbing. That's creepy. We're back to creepy.
And Michelle,
I'm more creepy.
That's
I
right.
want-
ID card.
I'm from Washington, and I'm here to creep you out.
Let me turn it from national and ask you, we're going to have a California gubernatorial before then. When does Condoleezza Rice emerge? Does she ever become governor of California, senator from California? I mean, we have two getting long in the tooth.
David dines with her regularly. I think you should ask David that
Well,
question.
I'm pretty sure Jerry's going to run again.
Well, if Jerry is going to run again, but who
and,
challenges him?
I don't think anybody, and no Democrat challenges him. I mean, you've got Kamala Harris, who is a potential, and Gavin. They will not go near that. So the Republican side, I don't know. Maybe
We've done Silicon Valley women.
Well,
Do we
maybe
now
an
go to
independent-
academic women.
Maybe an independent, maybe a Republican independent business person, like the guy that who's Bloomfield, who almost beat Waxman. Somebody who did a pretty good job, good campaign, and nearly took down a lion, of Congress. So maybe it's going to be that, like a Bloomberg kind of person could take him on.
All right, and David, we'll give you the last word since you had the most hideous journey here. Tell us what Condoleezza Rice is thinking about
Yeah, what is she-
politics.
I'm no kind of spokesperson for Condi Rice. I will simply observe what everybody knows, that she has never campaigned for office, and I've known her for 30 years, and it's very hard for me to imagine her on the campaign trail.
All right, good enough. I want to thank you all. I could spend, days and days going on with these people, but the night gets long, and I want to recognize two people that I'm not sure that I recognize to start with. One is Professor Henry Brady, the Dean of the Golden School of Public Policy. Please say hi. I have the pleasure of teaching some of his wonderful students how to write columns, and that's really a lovely thing. And the other person, if I haven't mentioned him before, is Hin Tran, editor-in-chief of the Berkeley Political Review, the only nonpartisan undergraduate campus magazine on here at Berkeley, and they do a terrific job. So please applaud them. Thank you all very, very much for showing up on a cold, rainy night.
Lisa,
it was lovely to see you. Thank you.
Pleasure to meet you. I hope